Looks like they're ready.
Yep, I think you could start at any time.
All right, good morning again. This is the first of 4 introduction talks into the different CBRNE areas. This one will talk about chemicals and chemical weapons. Excuse me. Next slide, please. In this section, we will talk about a number of things about defining what is a chemical weapon. We'll define some key terms that will be used in later in this talk and in later talks this week. We'll talk about the hazards and the effects of these chemicals and the chemical weapons. Talk about some history of how, you've heard a little bit of history of how these have been used. We'll give a few more examples of that. And we'll try to identify some important characteristics and considerations. This will be an overview talk, a basic talk. And later this week, we will give more details on chemical agents, the chemicals themselves, the materials, and the equipment that's used to make these kinds of weapons. So let's go to the next slide. So what is a chemical weapon? It's essentially any weapon that uses a toxic chemical to spread the chemical around with the intention of causing either death or injury or incapacitation or even just simply sensory irritation through its chemical action on the human body. We can classify these in several categories. There's often, when we talk about chemical weapons, we talk about military chemical weapons and warfare agents. We'll talk a lot about those, including agents that cause choking, they cause blisters, they damage your nervous system, and they can affect the way your blood carries oxygen to the body. In addition to those, though, there are many improvised chemical threats that are of big concern. They're of big concern because these chemicals are also toxic, maybe not as toxic as some of the military agents, but they are much easier to acquire. So these include toxic industrial chemicals. They've mentioned already chlorine. One of you early on mentioned hydrogen cyanide, and ammonia is another one. These are very common chemicals that are also very toxic. There are also many agricultural chemicals, primarily pesticides. They are designed to chemically kill insects. Well, because they do that, they can also be very dangerous to human beings as well. So let's go to the next slide. And I mentioned briefly the categories of agents. And again, we're going to talk much more about these later. But we can categorize them as follows. Nerve agents, as the name sounds, they act on your nervous system. And we'll talk more about these effects later, but they somehow affect your nervous system. The common names for some of the the names for the most common nerve agents, there's somen, sarin, tabin. Those were all developed just before or during World War II, and later a more potent one, VX, was developed. And there are others as well. Blister agents have been around for about 100 years, at least 100 years. These fall into several categories. There are the mustard agents, sulfur mustard and nitrogen mustard. Let me tell you a little bit about that name, just to avoid confusion. I don't know how the word mustard translates into Vietnamese, but in English, a mustard can refer either to the condiment that you put on your sandwiches, or it can refer to a plant that has a yellow flower and yellow seeds in it, and it produces the mustard seeds. That is not at all what that is. It was originally named that because the original chemicals, the impurities, smelled a bit like mustard, like garlic and onion, and that stuck. So other than the name has nothing to do with the stuff you put on your bread. Anyway, There's another blister agent called lewisite that was developed at the end of World War I. Blood agents, again, hydrogen cyanide was mentioned earlier, another cousin of that, cyanogen chloride. These agents work primarily by blocking the ability of your blood to carry oxygen to where it's needed for cells to work. A choking agent, as it sounds, can cause choking, and it has other effects too that are even more serious than choking, as we will see. In the bottom left, these are not toxic agents, but they're incapacitating agents, and they somehow prevent you from doing something. For example, they might make you sleep. They might make you dizzy so that you can't stop the terrorist or something. An example of that is something abbreviated as BZ. By the way, many of these chemicals, the actual chemical name is very long and complicated, so we use these shorter names to refer to them. There's other possibilities, again, though, susceptible to misuse. Pharmaceutical-based agents. You know that some pharmaceutical drugs are very powerful. They can put people to sleep, such as anesthetics and things like that. These could be used as a weapon if someone knows how to do that. Many toxic industrial chemicals, we'll talk a lot about those. Sometimes you'll hear the abbreviation TIC, the TIC in toxic industrial chemicals. We'll refer to TICs sometimes. And toxic agricultural chemicals, as I mentioned, things like pesticides. And there are riot control agents, things like tear gas that police might use against crowds. So we'll talk more about these in detail. Let's talk a little bit about the history now, though, on the next slide. So chemical weapons, the first major use of chemical weapons in warfare was during World War I. Now, there are actually some examples of chemical weapons that go back hundreds of years, although they were fairly minor uses of that and certainly not very poisonous. But it wasn't until World War I that huge amounts of these were used and made. The first big example was when the Germans used chlorine gas against the British and French troops. And you can see in the picture on the right what looked like clouds being blown from the right side to the left side. Those are all tanks of chlorine gas that's being released, and it's blowing downwind onto the troops. And the picture on the right shows some of the World War I soldiers with gas masks. At the time that first attack took place, they weren't prepared for that, and it did not have gas masks. Gas masks had to be invented to help the soldiers survive some of these attacks. So that's the first major use, but there are many more. Next slide, please. In World War II, fortunately, there were not many, if any, reported uses of chemical weapons in battle, although the Nazi Germany government had discovered and stockpiled many new nerve agents when they were discovered. In fact, nerve agents were first discovered by chemists at a German company that made pesticides. And they realized that some of these that they made accidentally had so much toxicity that they were eventually made into military weapons. Fortunately, they were never used to our knowledge. There was an example of a chemical that was used to kill millions of people. And it was in the prisoner camps where the Nazis forced people into these prison camps, many of whom were exterminated using this product called Cyclone B. That was a material that released hydrogen cyanide and was used to kill millions of civilians, unfortunately. Next slide, please. There were a few instances between then and the modern era of using chemical weapons, although probably the biggest examples were in Iraq. During the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Iraqi forces used blister agents and possibly nerve agents against Iranian troops and caused many casualties. it was also true later in the late 1980s that at the time, the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, ordered his troops to use nerve agents and blister agents against some civilians. They were actually Iraqi civilians who were part of a group that the government did not like. So these are unfortunate examples, many examples of very effective and deadly use of some of these agents. Next slide, please. Most recently, during the civil war in Syria, there were reports of chemical weapons being used. And there was a lot of confusion for a long time because it was not obvious who had released these weapons and what kind of weapons they were. The OPCW, which is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which also is in charge of enforcing the Chemical Weapons Convention, sent chemists, a fact-finding mission. They sent chemists to test the soil and the plants in the areas, and eventually they confirmed with fairly high confidence that indeed chlorine, sulfur mustard, and sarin were used against, often against civilian populations. So I mentioned, I don't know if we're going to discuss the OPCW much more, but they do things like they do these inspections, and they are responsible for enforcing the laws of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Next slide, please. There have also been non-state actor, terrorist use of chemical weapons. It's already been mentioned of the incident of the Aum Shinrikyo group in Japan was actually able to produce sarin on their own. We're going to discuss that in a later talk about how they were able to do that. And they released it on a Tokyo subway. It turns out that not many people were killed because they did a poor job of spreading it, but it sickened many people. And again, we will discuss this more in detail later, this example more in detail later. The group of terrorists that in the around 2014 was able to take over large parts of northern Iraq and eastern Syria that call themselves the Islamic State. And the abbreviation of their very long Arabic name is Daesh. They were able to, first of all, confiscate some Iraqi chemical weapons when they took over those areas. They also later were able to produce their own mustard, sulfur mustard agent. So these were probably the two biggest examples to date of non-state actors acquiring or producing and using chemical weapons and using them as chemical weapon agents. And we'll talk later about the precursor chemicals. How did they do this? How did they make these using these precursor chemicals? What equipment did they use and what expertise did they need to do this, to make these? We will discuss that in later talks. Next slide, please. We'll change gears a bit and start talking about more of the improvised chemical threats from the toxic industrial chemicals, for example. Most, if not all, toxic industrial chemicals are what we are called dual use. That means they have legitimate commercial use for many applications. But they can also be used for harmful purposes. So some examples, we've mentioned a number of times chlorine gas. Chlorine gas is used extensively for purifying water to make sure the water does not have bacteria in it before you pipe it to people's houses. On the upper right, there's a danger poster with a skull and crossbones, excuse me, about anhydrous ammonia. Anhydrous means ammonia without water in it. So it's pure ammonia is used fertilizing crops, or it's used to make things for fertilizing crops. It's used industrially to make many products. It's used in some cleaning fluids. In the picture in the center bottom, nitric acid is very dangerous, but it's used for many things to make all kinds of pharmaceuticals and plastics and products and explosives, as we will see later. So you see these symbols on here, the sort of the skull and crossbones, and there's a picture under the nitric acid one with looks like what's a hand getting burned with some chemicals. These are what we call pictograms. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll start talking about these pictograms. This is an international system called the International Globally Harmonized System, or GHS, of classification and labeling of chemicals. So these pictograms have these little simple pictures that without even depending on what language you speak, you can identify what they are. So at the left, as you can guess, the skull and crossbones represent something very poisonous or acutely toxic. So it takes very little of that material to cause harm. The next one shows some, maybe looks like a liquid being spilled on a hand or a metal, and it's causing burns. These are corrosive chemicals, and they cause severe damage to your skin, to your eyes, and sometimes even to metals, things like that. The next one over shows what looks like the outline of a human, and there's some white areas in the chest, and that represents respiratory hazards, things that are dangerous when you breathe them. And these could be many different things. And there's one that maybe is not as bad as all those. The one on the far right, it shows an exclamation point. And it's something that is a warning that this may cause certain effects as well, but maybe not as severe as these other ones. So these pictograms, and there's many more, are used throughout the world to help identify the hazards. So next slide, we'll look at a few more. These are not toxic chemicals necessarily, but these are some other hazards. So the one on the left, you might guess, it shows what looks like a small ball maybe blowing up. That's explosives and other highly reactive materials that can explode. The next one showing flames is something that is flammable. For example, gasoline, petrol. Also, there are some chemicals that if you get them wet or if you let them go in the air, they will ignite all by themselves, and those can be very dangerous as well. The next one also has flames with the big O. Those are oxidizers, and those are very reactive with other chemicals. So by themselves, they're fairly safe, but when you mix them with other things, they can react very significantly. We're going to see more about oxidizers when we talk about explosives and homemade explosives. And finally, the little tank in the red, orange diamond is about compressed gases or liquefied gases. We'll talk more about what that means, a liquefied gas, in a little bit. So let's go to the next slide. And I think we have a question, and I think is this, it's one of these. So what, if any, industries in your country use toxic industrial chemicals? Or I'm sorry, this was not on my list, I apologize. Sorry, this one. Have you seen any of these symbols in your workplace? And if so, can you check which ones you've seen? And you can check more than one in this case. So we've got 8, 12. I know there's 22 of you, so I'll wait a little bit longer till we get some more. That looks pretty close to the total there. That's even more. Wow. Okay. So it looks like most of you have seen at least one of them. Flammable materials, very common, toxic materials, explosives, corrosives, Again, very, very common, and you will see these, and we will refer to some of these later. And the answers are still coming in. All right. Let's go to the next slide. There's another quiz. I don't know if this is another, this is just for using if you could use use the microphone and give me an example. It looks like most of you or all of you saw at least one. Can you give me an example of a toxic industrial chemical used in your country by industries in your country?
Có anh nào có câu trả lời ạ? Của hóa chất ạ?
I know earlier today somebody already mentioned hydrogen cyanide or hydrocyanic acid.
Mình vẫn đang chờ câu trả lời đấy.
Vâng, thì tôi xin phép được trả lời. Tất nhiên là tôi cũng không nắm được hoàn toàn rõ lắm. Tuy nhiên là có một số ví dụ là một số các ngành rất là bình thường nhưng cũng có sử dụng hóa chất độc hại. Có thể lấy hai ví dụ. một là tất cả một số cái ngành mà sản xuất bóng đèn chẳng hạn thì có sử dụng thủy ngân, thì đấy cũng là một cái chất độc hại. Và chẳng hạn như là một số cái ngành, đặc biệt các ngành khai khoáng thì họ sẽ sử dụng các cái hóa chất để tách kim loại ấy, thì cũng là các cái hóa chất rất là độc. Thế còn những cái axit mà gây ăn mòn thì rất là sử dụng rất là rộng rãi ở trong rất là nhiều ngành công nghiệp, nên tôi cũng không thể kể tên hết được.
Cảm ơn em.
Yes, those are great examples. Something, for example, industries that process minerals to extract the metals or the other elements, that's a good one. Or that are manufacturing things. Many industries do that. Very good. Yeah, very good examples. Okay, let's move on to the next part, and let's talk about something a little more gruesome. What are the physiological effects? I mentioned what these things basically do, but let's talk first about blistering agents. As the word says, they cause blisters. Now, in most cases, things like sulfur and nitrogen musters don't cause them right away. If you get it on your skin, you may not have blisters develop for several hours afterwards. But these blisters can be very painful and very large. They cause severe damage to your skin. If you breathe the vapors from these, they can damage your lungs, damage your eyes, and you may not die from them, but these things are these blisters can easily become infected. And this is the kind of thing that can lead to death. So these are very painful type of effect. Next slide, please. Some chemicals that are not necessarily even toxic by themselves could cause oxygen deficiency. For example, they dilute the oxygen in the air. So if you have a lot of a closed room and somebody puts a lot of nitrogen or carbon dioxide in there, this could push the oxygen out and cause you to have difficulty breathing. Some of them, if you breathe them into your lungs, some may cause irritation in your lungs. We mentioned sulfur mustard and chlorine. Those will irritate your lungs, cause edema, which is fluid building up on your lungs, and can cause you to be unable to breathe. And as we mentioned, hydrogen cyanide and some other cyanides can interfere with your blood so that it cannot carry oxygen to your tissues. And all of those can make you very sick or, in fact, be fatal. Next is the nervous agents, I believe. Nerve agents cause a number of symptoms. These nerve agents work by blocking the ability of your muscles to work properly. And at small doses, you might not notice things, except you might notice your vision is becoming blurry. You might notice some unusual sweating, even though it's not hot outside. If you have a moderate exposure, it can cause other symptoms like physical weakness or nausea, and extreme exposures to these, sometimes very small amounts, will cause your muscles to go into spasms and seizures, cause loss of consciousness. It can paralyze you and stop your breathing and eventually cause death. So very, very serious effects. Next slide, please. So we, again, another picture of the Aum Shinrikyo attack. So certainly these chemicals can harm human life, as we've said, and cause injury and death. Beyond that, though, they can also, especially in crowded areas, create panic and shock among the crowd. So in the case of the Aum Shinrikyo attack, I think it was only about 12 people who actually died of exposure to the nerve agent. But there were hundreds and hundreds of people who went to the hospital, several thousand, most of whom could not possibly have been exposed to the nerve agent, yet it was the behavior of the crowd that caused them to panic and may have caused other injuries and put them into shock. So these are some side effects. The other effects, you see a medical person wheeling a patient on the gurney. If they get exposed, they themselves could be affected, and that would make it difficult, obviously, to treat the casualties. Okay, next slide, please. And again, you can have some long-term, in addition to just immediate panic. If your buildings or streets or other things are contaminated with these chemicals, you'll have to clean them up, and that could take weeks or even months, and it could take a lot of money. It could affect your economy and cause it to slow down, and it could make your population nervous that this may happen again. So these are many side effects of these attacks, and there are other reasons that we don't want them to happen. Next slide, please. All right, so where do these chemicals come from, these toxic industrial chemicals? Well, as I said, they're used in many, many industries. You can see on the lower left these stacks of large 55-gallon drums, can use in storehouses. They are present in laboratories and in university laboratories or research laboratories. They're made in factories. There's a picture of a huge refinery and a chemical factory that can store and produce large amounts, and then they have to be transported. So they may be transported in these railroad tank cars or large trucks. And as we saw earlier, if there's an accident, whether intentional or not, the spilling of these chemicals could cause severe damage. It could also allow some terrorists to get them illicitly by stealing them, or maybe they have a friend who works in this warehouse and they're able to get it for them. So, and sometimes they actually are able to purchase these without anyone being suspicious. So there's many ways that they can be available to terrorists. Next slide, please. So there are, excuse me a minute, while I get a drink. So one of the problems to the terrorists, this is a problem to the terrorists now about using these effectively. Just because the terrorist has these doesn't mean they can use them well. One of the things of concern, the terrorists might poison themselves accidentally if they don't handle it correctly. Or maybe they'll mix some chemicals together and make something poisonous and harm themselves. They also might need some experts to help them decide how to make this chemical or what's the best way to use it. So there's some expertise as well. So just because they get the chemical, they may not automatically be able to use it effectively. So next slide, please. We're going to talk about some concepts now that we're going to use later in the course, not just for chemicals, but maybe for some other of the agents, the CBRNE agents as well. And we're going to talk about 5 things: toxicity, the state, and there's a specific meaning to that, persistency, volatility, and reactions. So let's start with the first one, toxicity, on the next slide. So what is toxicity? We think we know. It means that it's poisonous, right? It means that it's bad. Well, specifically, toxicity can depend on many different things. It can depend certainly on the chemical itself. Now, all chemicals to some degree are toxic. This might be hard to believe, but water is toxic. If you drink too much water, you can die from it, and that has happened to people. Fortunately, it's also very important to us, and it would take an awful lot of it. On the other hand, a very poisonous chemical you might not need very much. And that's the second item on the bottom, called the dose. How much dose does it take to do this? And here's an example. We use a term in toxicity called LD50. That stands for lethal dose 50%. And what that means is, if you expose a bunch of people to the same dose of this chemical, 50% of them will be expected to die from it. So, for example, vitamin C, which is a very healthy thing to take, is actually, if you take enough of it, you're poison. It's very poisonous, but you would have to take about 12 grams for every kilogram of your body weight. You would need to eat an awful lot of vitamin C for it to be toxic to you. So in small amounts, it's very healthy. Caffeine, which you have in coffee and tea. You don't think of that as being poisonous, but it can be if you have too much. Now, again, it would take quite a bit, about 192 milligrams for every kilogram of your body weight. I think that would be many, many, many cups of coffee. And finally, though, sodium cyanide, which is related to the hydrogen cyanide that was mentioned earlier, that only takes about 6 milligrams per kilogram. So it's very, very much more poisonous. The dose is much less to cause the same toxic effect. It can depend on the person. If you're young and healthy versus maybe old and unhealthy, if you're a child or an adult, or if you're a larger person, it will take maybe more. How much time are you exposed to it? If I expose you to hydrogen cyanide a little bit at a time, it won't be poisonous. But if you get it all at once, it could be very toxic. And then how do you get it into your system, the route? Do you swallow it? Do you inhale it? Do you get it on your skin? Does it absorb through your skin? These are many things to consider when discussing toxicity. So if you go to the next slide, I think we're going to talk about the next time. Yes, the state. And this is the physical state of any material. And in general, we can say that there are 3 states of matter. There's solid, liquid, and gas. So you hear in this little short video, you see ice at the top, which is of course a solid, melting and turning into liquid water. And then you can see what looks like smoke. That's the liquid water evaporating into invisible gas. And that's what makes humidity in the air. So let's, we're gonna hold on to that. We're gonna discuss that in a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about the other 2 terms at the same time, persistence or persistency and volatility. Very simply put, persistency of a chemical is how long it can stay out, maybe on the ground or on the table or on your skin, before it somehow goes away. And volatility is related to that. Volatility is how easily can a chemical evaporate, turn into a vapor. So you know, for example, that if you spill a little bit of water on the counter, maybe at your house, if you don't clean it up, when you come back the next day, it'll be gone because it evaporated. And it evaporates kind of slowly. It takes a long time. Whereas if you spill, say, vegetable oil on the counter, you can wait 5 months and it's not going to evaporate because it's not very volatile. So volatile means it evaporates very quickly. Non-volatile means it does not evaporate very quickly. So if something is non-volatile, then it's probably going to be very persistent. It's going to stay there a long time wherever it got left. Whereas a volatile chemical will dissipate very quickly. So let's a few questions using those persistency and volatility. And I guess we're going to do this one. So in this case, question, which chemical is more volatile, gasoline or petrol or motor oil? So which one is more volatile? All right, we're just about done. And I think we'll stop it there. So if you said gasoline or petrol, that is correct. Gasoline is much more volatile. In other words, it evaporates much more quickly. If you've ever put gasoline in your car and some of it spills on the ground, it disappears very quickly. You can smell it because it's evaporating. Motor oil, some of it will evaporate. It will have some volatility, but much less than gasoline. It takes much longer for that to evaporate. Okay, good. Next question. Now, which of these, again, same things, gasoline or petrol, which is more persistent? All right, we're just about there, and it seems like everybody caught on to that. Motor oil is more persistent because, as we said, it does not evaporate as quickly as gasoline, so it will stay longer on wherever you put it, on the surface of the ground or on your skin or whatever. So now, remembering these two concepts, persistence and volatility, let's go to the next question. And which one of those, this is not gasoline or motor oil anymore, which one of these would make a better chemical weapon? Would it be a persistent chemical, a highly volatile chemical, or it could be either one depending on the circumstances? Yeah, it looks like we're just about there. Okay, most of you said that it would depend on the circumstances, and that is correct. Now the other answers are it depends. It can depend. For example, 4 of you said that a highly volatile chemical would be a better chemical weapon. That would be true if you wanted maybe to kill people very quickly, because a volatile chemical would evaporate and it would fill the room with the toxic fumes and it would be very effective. One of you said it would be a persistent chemical, and that would be true also if you want that chemical to be there for a long time so that it will poison people for many days, for example. So again, it could be, it really depends on the circumstances, but it depends what you want to do with it. Very good. You are all hard to fool. Okay, great. I think there's more questions next. In this one, the first question is, a terrorist wants to release a chemical weapon in an enclosed space. Which of these would make a better chemical weapon in this scenario? All right. Again, I guess it depends how you interpret that question. Now, if most of you thought it would be a highly volatile chemical. Now let's pretend that you're in a room and the ventilation's not very good and somebody releases a poisonous gas and that gas can't get out. So that would be very effective if a terrorist wanted to kill everybody in the room because it's trapped in the room. On the other hand, a persistent chemical, if you can't get out of the room, a persistent chemical might also be hazardous as well. But I think in general, what the idea here is that if you're going to use a volatile chemical, it needs to be in more enclosed space. If you use a volatile chemical outside, it can just blow away and not be very effective at all. All right, next question is related. If a terrorist wants to release a chemical weapon that will stay in the environment for several weeks, which would be better? All right, we can't fool you. You're all good, all did well. Of course, a volatile chemical will evaporate very quickly and the wind will blow it away. You need to use a persistent chemical to do that. Great, very good. All right, we will be using some of these concepts later. Okay, the next slide is one last term, and then we're just about done. The term chemical reaction. Sometimes we use the term chemical synthesis. And this has a very specific meaning. It means not just mixing chemicals together. It means actually mixing two or more chemicals come together and they make an entirely new chemical. Those chemicals that we're mixing together are called precursors. And we do some processing on them. For example, we might heat it, we might mix it, things like that. And what will result is an entirely new product that's totally different. So an example of that, if you've ever baked a cake, for example, you mix it with flour, which is a white powder, which doesn't taste much like anything. You put in sugar, which is a white crystal, which is crunchy and is sweet. You put in an egg, which is kind of gooey and yellow and white. And you put in some milk, which is a liquid. And well, you know, it tastes like milk. Now you mix these all together and you bake it, you put heat in it, and a chemical reaction occurs between all those ingredients and makes an entirely new material. It doesn't taste like any of them by itself. It tastes like them all together. So that's a very simple example. But later on, when we talk about chemical materials, we're going to talk about the difference between not just chemicals, but in explosives and maybe even some other things. Sometimes you can make, for example, an explosive by simply mixing two things together without a chemical reaction. Sometimes you need a chemical reaction. So those are going to be some differences we'll talk about later. All right, let's summarize, see what we've learned here. So a chemical weapon is any weapon that uses a chemical to cause harm to a human, or you could harm animals or plants as well by using the toxic properties of the chemical. Toxic industrial chemicals, or TICs, are more available and can also be used as improvised chemical weapons. These terms we discussed, toxicity, persistence, volatility, physical state, are important chemical properties that will influence the effects of the weapons and how it's used. And chemical weapons can be made using chemical reactions from precursor chemicals. Again, we're going to go into much more depth on these topics in the chemical materials and chemical equipment talks later on. All right, that's all I have for now. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If not, I think we're scheduled for another break, perhaps.